Go ahead and get started. I wanted to start by introducing myself. So my name's Hope Newport. I'm the Family Services Manager here at the International FOP Association. This is our 6th of 10 sessions in our Resilient Living educational series. And today we're going to talk about the ability to self-replenish. So this presentation portion of the meeting, which usually takes about 30 minutes, today might be a little less, just because this topic is one of the easier ones to cover, I think. But this recorded or this presentation portion where I'm just kind of, sharing content will be recorded and available afterwards. So if you're someone who likes to take notes, please don't feel the need to rush things down. The slides in a recording will be available afterwards. And because it is being recorded, I am going to ask everyone to mute their microphones just for this first bit where I'm kind of sharing information. That way people who go back and watch the recording don't have to enter or deal with any sort of like background noise or anything like that. So after I finish this initial part, we'll kind of unmute and have more of a discussion. But if you do have a question as we're going, please feel free to either put it in the chat or just unmute and ask me. I don't ever want the recording to prevent people from asking questions as they're coming up naturally. So yeah, but this, as I said, is our 6th session. This is our 5th faucet because the first session in the Resilient Living educational series was just sort of an introduction. But as we're going, I think people who've been participating for a while see that the faucets really build off of one another. So there is a good amount of sort of overlap or connectivity that we'll discuss. So for that reason, I always like to start with sort of a recap of the previous faucets that we've already covered. So the first faucet we discussed was emotional acknowledgement. And this is really one of the core, this is one of the big ones. Our ability to acknowledge our emotions is a huge part of being able to process and sort of move on from them. So before we can focus on a lot of other things, it's important for us to kind of take care of this foundation level stuff. So emotional acknowledgement is being aware of your emotional state, being able to name and feel your true feelings without judgment or without passing judgment on yourself for having those feelings, without trying to stuff, ignore, or talk yourself out of those emotions. So if you're denying your emotions, that's actually kind of going in the opposite direction of effectively coping with that stressor in life. It's really about remembering that when you acknowledge your emotions, you're able to diffuse some of the energy behind them. So a lot of times it can be painful for us to do that, but it's a really important part of us being able to kind of move on from them. And something that we focused on in every session, and that we'll talk about with the ability to self-replenish, is that it's important for us to remember that when we talk about resilience, or when we talk about stress and the resilience that we try to muster in response to that stress, it's really an unavoidable thing in life. There's no one who can go through life completely free of stress. So we know that if we can't avoid it, what we want to do is be able to prevent the stressors from carrying on for a long period of time. So we want to shorten them, be able to change our actions and kind of have control over how that stress impacts us. The second faucet that we discussed was the ability to self-calm. So this really goes hand in hand with emotional expression because it can be hard to calm yourself down if you don't really know what is causing the stress or the disturbance in life. So it's about being aware of your stress response and actively working to recover from it in the moment. And it's really important to, obviously it's not possible at all times, but to try to focus on restoring our calm in the moment, because the longer we hold on to that stress or the longer we're in that fight, flight, or freeze state, the more it impacts us. So this is the faucet where we discuss, what some of the physiological chain of events or consequences for our body are when we enter that fight, flight, or freeze response state. We talked about how it doesn't really matter if this was a big stress or a little stress. The body has that same biochemical reaction to both of those. And that during those times, staying connected to your breath and to yourself is one of the quickest and most effective ways to help calm your nervous system or to regulate. So that's why I have this picture of this person exhaling. This is really self-calming. I think a big part of it is, tuning into your body and focusing on breath. And then we also talked with this session about flipping the lid and how when we're stressed, our upper and lower brain, we experience this sort of disconnect, and that's not particularly helpful in these stressful situations, because in order to come back from these stressors, we want to be able to think clearly and communicate and use some of our higher functioning skills like reasoning and problem solving. So it's really important to kind of close that connection between our upper and lower brain, and self-calming is a really critical part of that. And then we looked at mirror neurons when we talked about self-calming. So that is, a really important part of us understanding that our behavior, the behavior that we model for others, actually impacts how they're able to regulate. Before we can help others, we really have to be able to regulate our own stress response and self-calm ourselves. So especially when we look at, some of our younger kiddos, or if we're working with families on this topic, it's really helpful to remember that the parent is sort of, the leading force, and they have to be able to self-calm before we can help our children learn to self-calm. And then lastly, just as with emotional expression, we focused on why it is so important to be able to bring yourself back from these stress reactions and recover in the moment to just prevent this fight, flight, or freeze response from having that lasting impact on our body. And then the third facet that we talked about was self-care. So self-care and the ability to self-replenish, what we're focusing on today, are really closely linked. When we talked about self-care, we examined why it's an important way of being able to sort of refill our cup, or our gas tank, our piggy bank, whatever analogy you want to use. But this is the first time that we sort of introduced the idea of all of these stressors have an impact on us, and we have to be able to sort of counterbalance the negative impact. And self-care is sort of the larger umbrella term for how we can sort of do that. So we dabbled on emotional self-care, and we kind of just said that varies a lot from person to person, and each individual has to do what's right for them in that moment. That is the emotional self-care aspect, is really sort of the heart of the ability to self-replenish. That's a lot of what we look at. It's very closely tied to self-replenishment. What we focused on when we talked about self-care was primarily the three key aspects of physical self-care. So we know there are specific systems in the body that help us recover. And when we eat, sleep, or exercise in ways to support our body and promote, self-calming, or our ability to bounce back from these stressors, that it really does impact our overall resilience. And we also introduced the concept that self-care and self-compassion go hand in hand. So, we must come to any activity that we're doing to sort of rebalance our refill our tank or our cup, with the intention of meeting our own personal needs in that moment. So if you, with self-care, for example, only, exercise because you feel like you have to exercise, yes, that exercise is still good for you, but it's not necessarily as great of a form of self-care. It's not necessarily refilling your cup if that exercise isn't what you wanted or what is best for you in that moment. So it's really about having compassion with ourselves and doing what is best for us in that moment. And then we also just kind of reiterated that, as with emotional expression and ability to self-calm, that self-care is something that we should integrate into our daily routine. And the more we practice it, the more easily it becomes a part of our natural habit, and the more accessible it is for us to use in those moments of stress to help our body recover. And then last month, the fourth facet that we talked about was hardiness. So we discussed the 3 C's of hardiness, and those are commitment, control, and challenge. And we discussed how commitment, this idea that people who are really committed to their work or to their project at hand is a vital aspect of our ability to be hardy in response to stress. So this involvement in different areas, it doesn't have to be work. It could be with family, with community, with religious community. That those involvements in those areas create an importance, and that importance gives our life added purpose. So this commitment to those different things motivate us to put in more effort in creating more goodness and meaning in our life. And control, this concept that we can influence our life events. This is also a really important part of us being able to remain hardy in the face of stressors. So when we looked at control specifically, we looked at how much control we perceive we have over any stressor and how that will influence our ability to cope with it. So specifically, we talked about internal and external locus of control and why it's really beneficial to have more of an internal locus of control. And then lastly, challenge. So this was, people who see difficult situations in life as a challenge rather than a disaster. So people who see things as a challenge tend not to ruminate on those things. They don't see that challenge as a total threat to them, and they're able to shift their perspective to see the situation in a new light. So this was sort of just a recap of the previous faucets that we've talked about, which I like to go over for people who may be joining for the first time and haven't seen these previous presentations. But I would say if you are particularly interested in any one of these, please go back and rewatch the recordings. There's some examples of exercises in there, and I'm also more than happy to chat with you about any of those. But today we are going to talk about the ability to self-replenish. So what is the ability to self-replenish? As I mentioned, it's a form of self-care. So self-care is sort of that larger umbrella of things that we do to help refill our tank. And self-replenishment includes those things that we do to restore our energy and our sense of well-being when life is draining. So we know that resilience is really about maintaining our inner reserves. It's about learning to recognize when you're becoming depleted and using these skills to fill yourself back up before you empty the bank or the tank or the cup, so to speak. So it's remembering that, for the approach to be sustainable, we must make continuous counterbalancing deposits to kind of offset these emotional withdrawals that we experience. So when we have practiced our ability to self-replenish, when our tank is full, we feel replenished, and we have this renewed ability to sort of sustain our needs over longer periods of time. So this analogy of renewable energy that there's sort of a photo for here on the right is not actually one that I have seen. It's kind of one that I just think works well. We'll talk about here in a minute a bucket and a dipper, and there's the coin bank or the bank analogy. But I think that renewable energy works really well for the ability to self-replenish as well, because it's just a good reminder that, we have access to the sun, water, wind, all of those things. And it's really about us being able to harness those that helps us have that sustainable sort of access to the things we need. So we have access to all the different or many of the different self-care, self-replenishment activities we're going to talk about today. But it's really just about us harnessing those activities and using them in a way that is beneficial for us to help support our long-term. So when we're replenished, we can enjoy peace of mind, feelings of calm, and just a general positive mental state. So I think, if you've been at a time in life where you feel like you've kind of filled up your tank, maybe you can identify that, oh, I felt replenished in that time. And I think we can all also identify maybe when we felt depleted. So this is when we are left with the unhealthy stress, and it's sort of, we have our energies zapped. It sort of undermines our will. We don't have that positive outlook or that optimism maybe that we had when we were more replenished. So that's something that we're going to discuss a lot more. You'll see the positivity runs through self-replenishment, and it has a big impact on how we can fill our reserve or our tank. So we'll talk about that here in a minute. But first I wanted to look at these, I think, fun kind of just infographic Or there are, to be quite honest, there are Instagram posts for an account that I follow, Blessing Manifesting. But they're just, I think, a really easy way to look at self-care. And so here on the left, you see the chart, and this could be a helpful, if you're someone who feels overwhelmed and has a hard time sort of sorting out what it is that's causing you to feel that way, that this can be a good way to sort of triage your needs. So here on the left, there you can see that there's physical, emotional, social, our larger overall mental health, and then our stress and our alone time. Like, how are we feeling in each of those domains? And so kind of using this chart to triage our own needs helps us then be able to prioritize how we focus our self-care. So this second picture on the right here, types of self-care, identifies some things that you could do, physically. If you're feeling really terrible, maybe you do some sleep, maybe you do some yoga, or you focus on your nutrition. For this emotional aspect, maybe you do some therapy, some journaling. Journaling is a really good gratitude journaling is a really important aspect of the resilient framework that I will talk about next month. But there's some suggestions here for all of the different areas that you may be experiencing stress, and some ways that you can work to counteract that. So I wanted to share this before we dive a little deeper into some aspects of self-replenishment, because I think it's important to just realize that self-care encompasses a lot of different things. And so when we're working on our self-replenishment, it is supporting all of these different areas of our life. So what do you need to know about self-replenishment? Well, firstly, it's important to remember that every person is different. So there is no cookie cutter way to practice self-replenishment. The strategies that you seek out should, be connected to your interest, your values, your hobbies, what it is you enjoy doing. And so for that reason, some things may work for other people and they may not work for you, and that's okay. And then also just remembering that self-replenishment activities help us recover on the go. So this isn't something that you wait till your bank is empty or your tank is empty to say, oh, I need to do my self-replenishment. This is something that we want to do consistently, and when we're feeling good, not just in the times when we're struggling. It's just the practice of continually building up that bank. And then thirdly, and this is a big one that we're going to talk about more, positive interactions are a critical part of self-replenishment. So being kind to others, sharing humor, these are a really easy way for us to get more replenishment, or for us to sort of easily access replenishment when maybe we're struggling a little bit to focus on that. So for example, you could think of some errands or tasks or situations that are normally really draining for you, and then integrate or plan some activities that can increase your positive or introduce sort of positive interactions in those otherwise draining events. So how do you train self-replenishment? This is where we're kind of going to back up and talk about why if emotional expression is hard, if we're not able to calm ourselves down and identify our emotions, self-replenishment can be a good place to start. And that we train by doing. So just jumping in sort of feet first and finding out what works for you, trying out different activities is the best way to really get started. But identifying a variety of activities that you can do in different situations or environments is important, because you won't always have access to the outdoors. So sometimes you'll want to plan indoor ones. You won't always have access to like your social support network to doing your self-replenishment activities in a group setting. So you'll want to have some that you can do alone. So there is, in the book that you should all have received, a long list of different activities that you can do for self-replenishment. I've just put a few of them up here. But I also want to talk about a little bit about how some of the things we've already talked about can be a really good way to train or increase your self-replenishment. So self-calming, that when we discussed that faucet, we dived into a lot of different relaxation activities. So those relaxation activities of deep breathing, meditation, journaling, those can be a really great way to practice self-replenishment. Self-care, so this is self-replenishment is sort of underneath the umbrella of self-care, but remembering to focus on nutrition, exercise, sleep, those are also important ways. And then one of the facets we haven't talked about, but self-supporting thoughts, is this emphasis on, the way we can restructure our way of thinking. And so doing gratitude exercises or journaling are a really good activity to kind of integrate that component into your self-replenishment list of possibilities. And you'll notice the self-calming, self-care, self-support, they all start with self, because they're all things that we have access to doing naturally. They're skills that we have that we just need to tap into and practice a little bit more. So I want to talk a little bit more about self-replenishment and why it's so beneficial for some of the challenging emotions that we have. So, there are no bad emotions. It's important to remember that every emotion we feel is valid, but some emotions are certainly more difficult than others. And so I think anger, fear, jealousy, disgust, those can be some of the more challenging emotions to cope with. And a lot of times this results in us, sort of denying or avoiding them. And when we do that, we have a really difficult time letting go or allowing ourselves to let go of them. And for that reason, those emotions, anger, fear, what are a lot of times more of the negative emotions, tend to hold their grip on us longer. And the longer we let these emotions hold their grip on us, the more they decrease our resource pool or our piggy bank. And so over time, these can really drain our energy and our overall resilience or ability to bounce back. So using positive interactions in these moments when we're really struggling to practice self-calming or to use emotional acknowledgement to identify what it is we're feeling can be a really positive way to bounce back from those challenging emotions. So it's a good way to sort of jumpstart that self-calming, some of the more complex aspects of resilience. And it makes like a simple positive interaction. So giving someone a compliment or, just telling a joke, saying hi can be a really good way of sort of letting go, making that negative emotion let go of us or decreasing its grip on us. So it kind of jumpstarts the self-calming, but it also jumpstarts the emotional expression, the sort of release of that emotion on us. So how can we integrate these positive interactions? There's two kind of key things that I wanted to point out. So first, positivity is grounded in reality. So for these positive interactions, it's not saying that you should just go through life with rose-colored glasses and ignore all of the stressors. It's really important that in our positiveness, we are still being authentic. So recognizing different things and praising different things are kind of a critical part of us being able to stay authentic in how we approach these positive interactions. So over here on the left is just sort of a circle of examples of some ways we can integrate these positive interactions. So finding opportunities for agreement, for shared viewpoints on something, doing and these obviously do depend on the situation, but sometimes making a joke, accepting someone else's perspective, being courteous, just simple please or thank you, being able to empathize and apologize with someone else, praising someone for something they did. And again, this can be just a really little thing that you have a negative emotion, or you have some stress with a particular person, and just finding something good that they've done and being able to share that compliment with them is a really simple way to sort of begin to break down that negative emotion. Telling someone you care about them, that one can be a little more challenging. Making acquaintances with new people and new situations, and just smiling. So those are just a few examples of positive interactions. Some of them are a little more broad and open-ended, things you could do with strangers, and some of them are more focused on, maybe a particular relationship where you're struggling with someone else. But there is some research behind this, and so a few points that I just wanted to bring up from that are that there's sort of a magic ratio for these positive interactions. So not that I would encourage anyone to necessarily tally their interactions, but we know that for every one negative interaction, there's sort of a 5 positive interactions to kind of offset that. So in the studies found that environments where the ratios were greater than 3 to 1 of positive to negative interactions, those sorts of environments are significantly more productive, more healthy, more effective than anything less than that. So for, 3 or 2 or 1 positive to 1 negative, those environments are sort of stunted by that relationship. But this is where the authenticity or really grounding it in reality comes into play, because like I said, it's not all rose-colored glasses, and it's important to remember that if this ratio gets too high, so 13 to 1 was sort of the range where they, or the threshold where they identified that the effectiveness kind of starts to wane again because it just doesn't feel authentic. So too much of those things are, too much of anything, is not great, is kind of how the saying goes. And so it is keeping it in moderation, but mostly just making sure that what you're saying is meaningful. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is another theory related to self-replenishment, and this is also focused on sort of the positive interactions. It's the concept of filling your bucket. So the theory is kind of described by this picture here on the right, that everyone has an invisible bucket. And we all obviously want our buckets to be overflowing, because at our worst, they're empty and we're just drained. We have no energy, or there's more room for negativity. So every person has this invisible dipper, and in each interaction that we have with each other, we use this dipper to either fill or to sort of take away from the other person's bucket. So whenever we choose to fill another person's bucket, we are not only helping them, but that in turn also helps us. And so how this works is that this positive interaction leaves us walking away with a feeling of increased well-being, because we know that we've made a difference. We've realized, we've noticed ways that our positivity can impact others, and that's rewarding for us. So another point of this that I think is helpful to bring up is that, in this theory and this approach to life, we can either be passive and sort of wait for someone else to come along and fill our bucket, or we can be more proactive. And, when we're out in society or when we're interacting with others, we can do it in a way that we are filling their bucket. And in doing that, knowing that it's also filling our own. So yeah, this question here at the top, if people can be destroyed by unrelenting negative reinforcement, can they also be uplifted and inspired to a greater degree by similar levels of positive reinforcement? And I think some people would argue this with you, but I think that the answer is that I've experienced, and that I hope, if you're someone who already does this, or who is going to start trying to make a more concerted effort to be positive in their interactions with others, that you'll be able to agree that yes, there is definitely a difference we can make by doing this. So here's an example of some questions that you might ask yourself if you're kind of wanting to gauge whether or not you already do this. So have you helped someone in the past 24 hours? Are you courteous to others? Do you like to be around positive people? Do you smile at people? When you receive recognition, does it make you want to give recognition to others? So these are all things that we can do to increase our positive interactions. And this quote by Maya Angelou is, I think, further evidence to the idea of why it is that we want to fill others' buckets. Is because, in knowing that people will never forget how you make them feel, you're sort of filling your own bucket as well. But, choosing just one item from this list, and this list is also in the booklet that you all should have received. So a more extended version of this is, but just, even if you keep it on your bedside and you focus on one thing that you say, today, I'm just going to pick one of these things and make an effort to do it. That's a really good way to start to sort of integrate this into your daily practice. But I did want to focus a little bit more on our emotional buckets, because that's really what our ability to self-replenish kind of narrows in on. As I said, self-care is a little bit more of a physical, it's the larger overarching, but it definitely focuses on more of the physical: sleep, nutrition, exercise, those sorts of things. Whereas self-replenishment, I think of it more as our emotional ability to practice self-care and refill our reserves. So for that, I think there can be some things that we don't necessarily recognize as fillers or as drainers. So I did find this list, and I wanted to kind of go through it with you all just to start to raise awareness about some of the ways that emotionally we're filling our bucket. So by setting boundaries and sticking to them, this can be a really hard one to do, but I think it's important to really look at, the way you're extending yourself in your relationship with others and recognizing if that's healthy. Knowing that your value isn't gauged by sacrifice, knowing that what value you can bring to your own life, and making sure that in your relationships with others, you are receiving as much as you give. So this isn't necessarily to say that, you give someone a lasagna at Christmas time and they give you a dish back. It's more just knowing that in your friendships, you're recognizing those that are supportive in return, and those that maybe you're just the one who's constantly kind of fielding the fires, and helping that person resolve the issues without them being there to reciprocate the same for you, and separating your self-worth from others' opinions. And then some of the drainers that I just like to kind of raise awareness about are being aware of when you're trying to value what you give, or tying your value to what you give others. Knowing, that you may say yes when you want to say no in one or two too many circumstances. Sacrificing yourself so that other people will love you more. Sacrificing things that are, important to you, because you think you have to give that up so that someone else will love you more. Letting people take advantage of you. So this can be just, with specific skill traits you have, knowing when maybe people are using those without necessarily being as thoughtful or as appreciative of your time. And then putting others' wants before your needs. So this is something that, again, it's a lot. I think this is sort of a deep topic to dive into in a presentation and move on to the next slide. But it's an important starting point for kind of evaluating how these things may be affecting your emotional bucket. So the end goal of the ability to self-replenishment, it is this awareness, this goal that we learn to recognize when we're becoming depleted, and that in those instances we've already done different activities, or we're taking the steps to replenish our energy and our sense of well-being. So this self-replenishment is a big part of our larger self-care plan, but we should always be going beyond those basic things, like the sleep, the exercise, the nutrition, to keep our body healthy. So it's about doing those things that fill us up regularly, not just when we feel run down. So that is sort of the presentation portion of today's faucet.